Good afternoon. On behalf of Arts Empowering Life, I'd like to welcome you to our God of Our Fathers series, Mighty Miracles of the American Revolution. My name is Sister Danielle Dwyer, and along with Lillian Meow, we coordinate this series. As many of you know, the purpose is looking toward our 250th anniversary. And we've taken time to recall and remember those moments of divine intervention, moments of real courage, and places where we can see the outline of the hand of God over our nation. Today's speaker is Dr. Jerry Newcombe, and he will be talking to us about the ride of Paul Revere, Lexington and Concord battles, and Sam Adams. I did ask if he was going to talk about the beer, and he said no. I said, as Massachusetts residents, we do know a little bit about that, and he is known to us in that way, but he said the man is so much more than that. So, looking forward to that. A little bit about him is that he serves as the executive director of the Providence Forum, as well as a columnist and podcast host for the Forum. He has produced more than 100 hour-long television specials that have aired nationwide. He has appeared on numerous talk shows, Fox News and Business News, C-SPAN, and Bill Maher, to name just a few. He is also the author or co-author of 33 books, which at least 2 of them have been bestsellers. George Washington's Sacred Fire with Dr. Pete Lillback, and What If Jesus Had Never Been Born with Dr. Kennedy. And a most recent one he co-authored with Dr. Mark Beliles, our May speaker, on the life and legacy of Thomas Jefferson, called Doubting Thomas. Jerry is senior pastor at New Presbyterian Church in Wilton Manors, Florida. He resides in South Florida along with his wife, Kirsty, and I was told by them that they had a chilly wake-up call this morning on Cape Cod. He's a good friend of Dr. Peter Lillback and Bill Federer, those who are familiar to us. And he has worked with speakers that we've already heard or will be hearing in the future. So there's a lot of familiarity and a lot of friends, shared friends. Before I bring him onto the stage, just to reiterate how we do the questions. He'll talk for about 45 minutes, and then we'll allow 15 minutes or so for questions. Please come to this microphone right here in the center, and if you're unable to come there, just let us know, and we'll bring a microphone to you. So, please join me in welcoming Dr. Jerry Newcombe.
Well, good afternoon, and thank you so much, Sister Daniela, and thank you so much, Lillian, Meow, and all the sisters and brothers that have helped us. It's wonderful to be here. So thank you. God bless you. I just spoke with my good friend, Bill Federer. I said, Bill, say a prayer for me. I'm just about to go on. And he said, Father, bless his speech in Jesus' name. Amen. So this year we celebrate, obviously, America at 250. What is it that we celebrate? Okay, well, on July 4th, 1776, 56 men in Philadelphia, by voice vote, approved the final wording of the Declaration of Independence. It was to be signed a month later, or they began the process of signing it a month later. And so we celebrate really this idea that we were declaring independence from England, but at the same time, we were also declaring dependence upon Almighty God. If you read the document itself, you see 4 times it mentions God in one way or another. Above all, says that God is the source of our rights. And so we want to talk about, we've mentioned these things. I want to talk a lot about Samuel Adams, and it ties into the Midnight Ride of Paul Revere, as you'll see in just a moment. But Samuel Adams is really a largely forgotten founding father. Yes, he's known today as the beer guy or whatever. It's not even accurate in many ways. you'll see later why you can make a sort of a link to Samuel Adams, but even the image that they use on that product is not Samuel Adams himself. But Samuel Adams is, I think, the grandfather of America. If you could say that George Washington is the father of our country, and I think that's absolutely appropriate to say that. And Samuel Adams, though, is the one who really helped get things going. George Bancroft, America's first great historian, I'll mention him later, but he said no one has done more to bring about independence than the elder Adams. The younger Adams would be John Adams, his second cousin, whom we'll mention later. Samuel Adams recruited him to the cause. Samuel Adams was the lightning rod of the American Revolution, and he also was, in the words of Thomas Jefferson, the patriarch of our liberties. He was the last of the Puritans. That's a phrase coined by Bancroft, but it's very appropriate. And the first of our founding fathers. He was the first to seriously agitate for American independence. Because of him, Boston became the epicenter of a lot of the conflicts that ultimately led to our independence. And there's a link between him and Paul Revere's famous ride. The fact that Boston was the epicenter of so much of the push for independence ultimately gets back, more than any single person, to Samuel Adams. So, listen, my children, and you shall hear of the midnight ride of Paul Revere. We all grew up hearing that beautiful poem from Henry Wadsworth Longfellow about April 18th, 1775, when Paul Revere and another writer who's not well known, but William Dawes, were sent out by Dr. Joseph Warren in Boston to alert the Patriots in Lexington and Concord about the British regulars coming. There were 2 lanterns on the steeple of Boston's Old North Church, and the signal was 1 if by land, 2 if by sea, and so the signal went out that night of 2 by sea. So what this meant was that instead of the British regulars marching up the Boston Neck, going by land, instead they were rowing across the St. Charles as they were working their way northwest to Lexington, Concord. All right, now, there were about 700 British regulars in Boston, and the goal was to destroy the colonial munitions that were there in Concord. So Concord was kind of the stated key goal. But on the way to Concord is Lexington, about 6 miles away, on the way. So why Lexington? Samuel Adams, as we'll see. Samuel Adams and John Hancock were in Lexington that night. That house that you see right there, that's a photo I took in Lexington of the manse, that is the pastor's house in Lexington. They were staying at the minister's house, Reverend Jonas Clark, not only Samuel Adams, but also John Hancock. John Hancock, in fact, had even stayed in that house a few times as a child. His grandfather had been the minister there until his death in 1752. He was the minister of the church in Lexington for 55 years. And by the time you get to 1775, our scene that we're talking about today, Lexington had 700 people. Now, there's a documentary I made, and my wife said I shouldn't say this, but I'm just going to say it. I was so honored to be interviewed by Charlie Kirk, and he talked to me about this documentary that I made. It's one of 7 films that I made about the history of America's Christian roots and so forth. It's called the Foundation of American Liberty series. But he said, "Hey, everybody, Charlie Kirk, today, Dr. Newcombe, and his amazing documentary, The Road to Independence." So anyway, in our documentary, where one of our guests was a docent from the Boston area, Rich Holland, and he was explaining as a tour guide why Samuel Adams and John Hancock were the targets of the British that night, April 18th, 1775, the night of the midnight ride of Paul Revere. He said Reverend Jonas Clark was the minister of the church in Lexington. He hid out Samuel Adams and John Hancock in his home because the British were looking for them. The king would write a letter to the governor. He says, I'll give everybody a pardon if they just lay down their arms and obey the king's laws, except for two people, Sam Adams, John Hancock. If you catch them, instantly hang them, no jury, no trial, no appeals, instantly. It was the thinking of the king and some of the people in Parliament and so forth that there's just a few rabble-rousers in New England and Boston that if we just get rid of those, as Sam Adams being the chief one, then all of this rebellion would stop. One thing Reverend Jonas Clark had told Samuel Adams and John Hancock that night and the early morning of the 19th is that he had been training his men, lay leaders in his church, to take a stand on the Lexington Green, that is the lawn, the large lawn in front of the church. Take a stand with your arms. Certainly don't fire on anybody unless fired upon, so that they would take a stand for their God-given rights. He had trained their men for that very hour. And this is an interesting point. You could see this, that statue there to the Minutemen in Lexington. I took that photo. A lot of times the Minutemen, they got their name because they were ready in a minute's notice, and a lot of times they were basically the lay leaders in local churches. And that was certainly the case in Lexington. Now, I want to keep referring to and quoting George Bancroft. I took the time to get his 6 volumes, and it's very difficult reading, actually, for us today. 1885 was the final version of his History of the United States of America. George Bancroft, Harvard-trained historian. He served as the U.S. Secretary of the Navy from 1845 to 46. He established the Naval Academy at Annapolis and wrote this wonderful book, or series of books, rather, on the history of America. And he did not censor and cut out the God parts. That's what's happened today too often, is God has been censored from American history, but you can't tell the story properly and leave God out of it. I mean, we're not one nation under God by some sort of accident. We're one nation under God by design, by the design of the Founding Fathers. America at 250, we hold these truths to be self-evident. All men are created equal and are endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights. George Bancroft said, at 2 in the morning, so that would be April 19th, 1775, under the eye of the minister, Reverend Jonas Clark, and of John Hancock and Samuel Adams, Lexington Common was alive with the Minutemen. The roll was called, and of militia and alarm men, about 130 answered to their names. The captain, John Parker, ordered everyone to load with powder and ball, but to take care not to be the first to fire. Now look at this stone in Lexington. I took a photo of this. These are the words of Captain Parker. You could see at the very bottom. Maybe you can't see that, but the words here he said to the Minutemen that night, or that morning, actually, wee hours of the morning. Stand your ground, don't fire unless fired upon, but if they mean to have a war, let it begin here. Speaking of the Lexington Church in Massachusetts, Bancroft observed how often in that building had they, with renewed professions of their faith, looked up to God as the stay of their fathers and the protector of their privileges. When the two parties, the well-disciplined British Army, strongest army in the world at the time, and Navy too. So they basically go up against this ragtag assembly of farmers, merchants, people men standing for their freedom. When they encountered each other, it became very clear the Americans were hopelessly outnumbered. Captain Parker commanded his men to depart, but before they could, there was an accidental shot. As we see, Reverend Jonas Clark thought it came from the British side. Docent Holland notes, Parker said, if they mean to tell you to go home, but if they tell you to lay down your firearms, refuse to do so. Refuse to do it because by British law, British common law, we have a right to bear arms. So as they were dispersing, they were turning around, going back to their houses, a pistol shot rang out. Jonas Clark said it was a British officer who shot first. And soon the British fired over and over in that slaughter. 7 Americans were killed, both old and young, and 9 were wounded. Once the shooting began, the outnumbered Americans quickly fell back, and the British troops then marched on to Concord, again 6 miles away, but they had left death in their wake. there on Lexington Green. Bancroft observes, there on the green lay in death the gray-haired and the young. The grassy field was red with the innocent blood of their brethren slain, crying unto God for vengeance from the ground. The ground on which they trod was the altar of freedom, and they were to furnish the victims. Jonas Clark, and this is the place where the fatal scene begins. They approach with the morning light, and more like murderers and cutthroats than the troops of a Christian king. Without provocation, without warning, when no war was proclaimed, they draw the sword of violence upon the inhabitants of this town. And with a cruelty and barbarity which would have made the most hardened savage blush, they shed innocent blood. Yonder field can witness the innocent blood of our brethren slain. There the tender father bled, and there the beloved son. And meanwhile, the British marched on to Concord, about 6 miles away, and there at Concord did the Americans shoot back. And years later, Ralph Waldo Emerson wrote a poem about that day's Concord battle, and he called it The Shot Heard Round the World. Of course, Lexington, Concord were the same day, so if you say the shot heard round the world, Lexington, Concord, it all fits. It's April 19th, 1775, the beginning of the American War for Independence. Now, the British failed in their mission at Concord to capture the munitions. During the combined battles of Lexington and Concord on April 19, 1775, approximately 49 Americans total and 73 British soldiers were killed. But as the British were retreating from Concord on their way back to Boston, maybe you can't see that slide very well, but that says Battle Road, and it gives the date, April 19, 1775. A lot of Americans were behind trees and so forth shooting at the British soldiers as they were leaving, because they had slain some of these Americans. And in fact, Thomas Jefferson said after Lexington, Concord, before the 19th of April, 1775, I never heard a whisper of a disposition to separate from Great Britain. Samuel Adams, when the dust settled after the killing in Lexington, Samuel Adams reviewed the damage, and George Bancroft writes, heedless of his own danger, Samuel Adams, with the voice of a prophet, exclaimed, oh, what a glorious morning this is, for he saw his country's independence hastening on. Lexington Concord came about in large part because of a series of British missteps, and Samuel Adams and others, but mainly Samuel Adams, calling them out on it. He is perhaps the most overlooked of our founding fathers, and yet he played such a vital role in getting the whole ball rolling for American independence. That's why Jefferson called him the patriarch of our liberties. There's a wonderful book, happy to recommend, 2022. The author is Stacy Schiff, and this is a wonderful biography called The Revolutionary, and she called Samuel Adams the most essential founding father. John Adams said, without the character of Samuel Adams, the true history of the American Revolution can never be written. And Stacy Schiff adds, his second cousin John swore that Samuel was born to sever the cord between Great Britain and America. So here, let me just give a couple of highlights of Samuel Adams' life and his work overall. He was active in the Sons of Liberty. We'll say more about that in a moment. He actively resisted the Stamp Act of 1765, the first major conflict. He initiated the Committees of Correspondence. This is a way that the colonies could communicate with each other. He was a key leader of the Boston Tea Party. He was an active force in the early Continental Congress and a prime mover behind the Declaration of Independence, which he signed. He was a state senator and also later governor of Massachusetts, and again, he was the lightning rod of the American Revolution. He was born in 1722 in Boston and died in 1803. He graduated twice from Harvard, having written a master's thesis basically asking the question, must submission to the government always be absolute? And his basic answer was no. He had a biblical worldview. Sometimes there is a place where we must obey God rather than men, if it's an either or. Now, while at Harvard, he was impacted by the preaching of the Great Awakening. Right now, there's this wonderful movie out called A Great Awakening. Highly recommended to everybody to see this. So he was touched by that, spiritually awakened to Christ as a young student, and this would have a profound impact on his life, including even his politics. He was immersed in Bible-influenced culture and eventually became one of its most eloquent proponents and spokespersons. George Bancroft said of Samuel Adams, "The austere purity of his life witnessed the sincerity of his profession, that is, profession of faith in Jesus. Evening and morning, his house was a house of prayer, and no one more revered the Christian Sabbath. He was a tender husband, an affectionate parent, and could vividly enjoy conversation with friends. But the walls of his modest mansion never witnessed anything inconsistent with the discipline of the man whose desire for his birthplace was that Boston might become a Christian Sparta. Such was his devotion, such his inflexibility and courage, he may be called the last of the Puritans." Stacy Schiff said, "It's impossible with Adams," talking about Samuel, "to determine where piety ended and politics began. The watermark of Puritanism shines through everything he wrote." She also said, "Religion played a central role in his life and his thinking, as it would in the Revolution. It was no accident that so many Boston town meetings were conducted in houses of prayer, or that republicanism, as envisioned in Massachusetts Bay, traced the independent-minded, egalitarian, community-based lines of Puritanism. Men who preferred a church without a bishop came naturally to the idea of a state without a king." She also said Samuel Adams is the patron saint of the late bloomer. He was 41 before really he found his calling. Prior to that, he seemed to fail at everything he touched, including he was a failed maltster. That's, I think, where the beer part comes in. It was some component related to making beer, but the interesting irony of that is his image is not even the one they used on the cans of the beer. So he's really the political writer that helped get the revolution going and, showing us why we should even have it. And I should note, as far as beer is concerned, in those days, water was not as safe to drink, and so beer and wine and so forth was a more safe beverage. Now, the Stamp Act of 1765, this is really where it all starts. The British Parliament passed the Stamp Act in 1765, and they did this because they had incurred a lot of money in the French and Indian Revolution, or French and Indian War, and they thought, well, we spent a lot of money and resources to protect the Americans. Yes, they helped and joined us in the fight so often, but they need to pay us back. So we're going to go ahead and levy these different taxes, and they didn't give the Americans input, and that violated the Americans' rights as British citizens under the British Constitution. Their God-given rights were being trampled on, and Samuel Adams was one of those early on to point that out. The law was passed on March 22. It was to go into effect on November 1, and I should say that it was a tax on all papers, legal documents, newspapers, even playing cards. You would have a tax on this. And when the Stamp Act was forced on Americans by the British in 1765, then Samuel Adams began to write on this injustice in Boston newspapers under pseudonyms such as Vindex Candidus, a Puritan populist, a son of liberty. And he did this for the next several years, fighting other British acts of oppression. He used 30 different false names to protect his identity, because this was a very dangerous thing that he was engaged in. It was very dangerous. In fact, Schiff tells a story that John Adams, one time, when he was sharing a room with Samuel Adams when they went to to Philadelphia for the Continental Congress, that he saw Samuel Adams was feeding to the fire all kinds of papers of writings of Samuel Adams. And he did that because he was trying to, get rid of his paper trail, because it was very dangerous what he was involved in. And so his writings were extremely influential. It's amazing. Now, I don't know if you're familiar with the Liberty Tree, but in Boston, near Boston Common, today it's at the Essex and Washington Streets. In those days, it was at the corner of Essex, and Orange Street was something called the Liberty Tree. This is a little relief, if you will, a little piece of art that's actually at that very intersection today, showing the Liberty Tree. Samuel Adams and the Sons of Liberties often met in secret or under the shade of that magnificent tree. Picture the leaves going down further and then men standing under that tree. And this was known as the Liberty Tree, or a Tree of Liberty. And in fact, for a few years now, Peter Lillback and I have been working on a book called Under the Liberty Tree, Samuel Adams and the Sons of Liberty. Very interesting stuff. The banner of the Sons of Liberty was a prototype of the American flag. 9 red and white stripes side by side. This was displayed there at that Boston Liberty Tree. And as the conflict began to increase, there were literally hundreds of Liberty trees so designated throughout the 13 colonies. And the prototype of them all was the one in Boston. The British chopped it down in 1775, and they turned it into firewood. And in places where they couldn't afford or they didn't have a tree available, the Patriots would use a liberty pole. And the liberty pole was usually was a tall mast, piece of wood like a pole, and they would put on top of it a palaeus, something from ancient Roman times, a freed slave's cap, and they would put that on top of it. You see right there the flag of the U.S. Army. To this day, that's the flag, and it's from 1775. Do you see at the very top, below the rattlesnake, there's a rattlesnake up there, you see the Liberty pole. If you look for it, you can see these Liberty poles all over the place. It was basically, if you will, a poor man's Liberty tree. It was one where they just didn't have a tree available. Even to this day, there are 3 states that have Liberty poles on their state flags. And this is the example from New York. Maybe you can't see it as well, but the lady to our left, she is holding a Liberty pole in her right hand. There's even a Liberty pole above the rising sun in the back of George Washington's chair at Independence Hall. And it's interesting. So the Declaratory Act, when Parliament discovered just how odious the Stamp Act was, they said, okay, we're going to have to rescind this. By the way, it hardly went into effect anywhere because the Patriots would just get so riled up about it, and they did things like tarring and feathering and just things that were not very pleasant, but it was a way of saying, no, you shouldn't do this. And so the men that were designated to be the stamp collectors, they said, okay, forget it, I'm not going to do this. It's not worth it. So the British Parliament learned that, okay, this is not good, so we'll get rid of it. But they also, at the same time, passed the Declaratory Act at the same time. And it basically said, even though we're going to get rid of this one tax, we are still showing you we have the authority to tax you whether you are represented or not. That was the Declaratory Act. And so, again, the Americans thought, oh, this is an attack on our God-given liberties, even though we live in a different continent. As King George III and Parliament and Loyalist governors kept passing laws taxing the colonists, Samuel Adams kept writing about this, all these problems. And finally, in October 1768, the British sent over troops. And instead of putting them in Castle William, there in Boston, in the Boston area, they actually said, okay, these troops have to live among you. So imagine, you get a knock at the door and some British troops come in and, okay, we're taking the master bedroom, and you can sleep in this bedroom over there. I mean, it's amazing. What could happen? What could go wrong if you had troops in your town, in a very self-regulated town like Boston? So on March 5, 1770, remember I said it was 1768 that the troops came over in October, there was an unruly mob of various people, including some unsavory characters, in front of the old State House. It was on King Street there in Boston. And there were some British troops there who were being taunted by the protesters, and some snowballs, even chunks of ice were thrown, and somehow a British gun went off, and then the British soldiers fired on the protesters, and 5 lay dead, and this was the Boston Massacre. And this awful incident was something that the Sons of Liberties publicized all over so that people would understand the tyranny the British posed to the Americans. In fact, Paul Revere made the engraving that you're seeing right there, that artwork, and one historical source said that this picture of the Boston Massacre was probably the most effective piece of war propaganda in American history. Now, if you ever go, next time you go to Boston and you get to go on Tremont Street by the Granary Burial Ground, and you see Samuel Adams' grave, make sure to look just to the left of Samuel Adams' grave. You see the 5 names of the victims of the Boston Massacre, March 5, 1770. And they would have annual sermons to commemorate what happened. In 1774, it was John Hancock's turn, and you can read those speeches online. Through his writings and organized events, Samuel Adams widely publicized the massacre. Historians say he worked behind the scenes to get his second cousin, John Adams, his attorney, to defend the soldiers. And this wasn't out of sympathy for the British, but rather for the strategic and principled reasons tied to the patriot cause. The chief being, look, we're not barbarians here in America. We have a commitment to fair trials and the rule of law. So John Adams defended those British soldiers that were involved in the Boston Massacre. And in that trial, he was successful, and he used that famous line, "Facts are stubborn things." When we talk about America as one nation under God, America at 250, that the Christian influence really helped lead to the independence we enjoy today, look at the facts. Facts are stubborn things. You look at the sources, such as the Avalon Project of Yale University. You want to read the actual documents and so forth. Or the Library of Congress, loc.gov. All these different items are found there. And I think that's an exciting thing. It's actually, the internet is a great tool for helping people to understand who want to dig deep into the how did America come to be what it is. In 1772, Sam Adams drafted a document called The Rights of the Colonists. It's viewed historically as a key document explaining why we should be independent. And he said, the right to freedom being the gift of God Almighty, the rights of the Christians, or the colonists as Christians, may best be understood by reading and carefully studying the institutions of the great lawgiver and the head of the Christian church, which are to be found clearly written and promulgated in the New Testament. And in May 1773, Parliament passed the Tea Act, and there was also a part of it called the Regulatory Act. They were really one and the same. And it was designed to bail out the struggling British East India Company by allowing it to ship tea directly to the American colonies and granting it a monopoly. And Samuel Adams did his best to try and oppose this measure. He did a lot to try and get people to say, look, we need to stop importing the goods and services, or the goods that we're using here. We should have the women start making more clothes instead of buying clothes from England, having spinning contests. We should find alternatives to drinking tea so we don't have to get sucked into this monopoly that England is now giving to the East India Tea Company. So all of these conflicts led up to December 16th, 1773, the Boston Tea Party. It wasn't called that initially, but what happened was American patriots dressed up as Indians, and on the night of December 16th, while Samuel Adams was having a meeting, first it was in Faneuil Hall, but it got so full that they had to go to the church nearby, the Old South Meeting House, to continue that meeting. And while he's talking, this happened. About 100, 150 men dressed as Indians came aboard these 3 ships that had come from England that had the tea from Boston. Dartmouth, and they were there in Boston. The Dartmouth, the Eleanor, and the Beaver. Suddenly, this group of men dressed up, they startled those aboard, and they solemnly warned them not to interfere, since they only came to do violence just to the T. And so historian Benjamin Carp writes, each man would disguise himself as an Indian and swear an oath to secrecy to be sure that their identities would remain secure. Everyone agreed on the ground rules. No one would steal or vandalize any property except the tea itself, and no one would commit to any violence or mayhem. Violence, no. Property damage, no, except for the tea, of course. And by the way, I read a book about the Boston Tea Party, and at the end they had an appendix where they were talking about, since we don't really know, these men were sworn to secrecy. A lot of them took that secret to their grave. They said there was one man that we do know he participated. And you know who that was? Listen, my children, and you shall hear of the midnight ride of Paul Revere. It was Paul Revere. The tea was in 342 very heavy chests. I took that photo at the Boston Tea Party Museum. It's a great place to visit if you haven't been there before. And they had to hoist these boxes up, without damaging them. There was even a case where there were some locks that they broke, and in some cases they actually came back later and gave a new lock. Sorry, I broke your lock, But they were only going after the tea. That's what they were doing. So for the next hours, these protesters systematically dumped the contents of the heavy chest, one after another, of fine tea. By the time it was over, 46 tons or 92,600 pounds of tea were put into the harbor. One man said, we've only been making a little saltwater tea. In effect, they turned Boston Harbor into one big teapot, if you will. Historian Les Standiford comments on the reaction to the Boston Tea Party of Sam Adams' younger cousin, even John Adams, no advocate of mob violence or mob action, wrote in his diary the next day, there's a dignity, a majesty, a sublimity in this last action of the Patriots that I greatly admire. It must have so important consequences that I consider it an epoch in history. Author Benjamin Carp says, the tea men had made their point. This was supposed to be a mission of destruction, not a free-for-all for looters. The Reverend Samuel Cooper called it a remarkable instance of order and justice among savages. Thomas Hutchinson was the loyal governor, and he was kind of the nemesis to Samuel Adams, and Samuel Adams' nemesis was Thomas Hutchinson, and Thomas Hutchinson's biggest nemesis was Samuel Adams. Anyway, even Hutchinson had to admit that the whole affair was conducted with very little tumult. In 1963, Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., in his last version of his letter from the Birmingham jail, he said, in our own nation, the Boston Tea Party represented a massive act of civil disobedience. Now, when England heard about the Boston Tea Party, a few months later, transportation and communication, were very slow in those days. They were very angry, and they came up with the Port Act. And the idea of the Port Act was, on June 1, 1774, we're going to close the Boston port. We're just going to have all these massive British ships, warships, come in to Boston. And they will not allow any importing or exporting. And part of the goal of the British was, we'll isolate Boston, and that will solve this problem. But they didn't count on the other colonies getting involved. You see, Samuel Adams, going back to this committees of correspondence, he had this way in which they would sending out the word to all these other colonists, hey, this is what's going on in Boston. And so England was wrong to think that the other colonies would not get involved. So in Philadelphia, the bells of the churches were muffled and they tolled when the Port Act went into effect. They had their sails at half-mast. In Virginia, there was a widespread day of fasting and prayer that was called on behalf of Boston. Who wrote that prayer proclamation? Thomas Jefferson did. Mark Beliles and I wrote a book about Thomas Jefferson, Doubting Thomas. We have a new version of it coming out, which is basically shorter, and it's called Thomas Jefferson and the God Who Gave Us Liberty. But the shortened version about Thomas Jefferson, because I think he gets a bad rap too, the short version is that Thomas Jefferson later, he has some serious doubts, but he's not a lifelong skeptic. So when he was really important to the American cause in 1774, 1775, 1776, 1777, By all outward appearances, he is a professing Christian. He even started as a layman in 1777, the Calvinistical Reformed Church of Charlottesville. We, being desirous of gospel knowledge, we will start this church and we'll call the Reverend Charles Clay. He gave more of his money than any other person involved in that church. Yes, later he has some doubts, but it's wrong to take the Thomas Jefferson of 1820 and then impose his thinking on the Thomas Jefferson of 1776, who wrote, "We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal." America 250, it's our Declaration of Independence. So one man wrote in his diary, "I fasted all day and attended church." That was George Washington. People from other colonies sent to Boston food and other necessities during this time when Britain had closed that harbor. And in September 1774, for the first time, a Congress was called in Philadelphia, meeting at Carpenter's Hall. And George Bancroft wrote, "The Congress was resolved to exhaust every means of redress before sanctioning an appeal to arms." And the first time they met, September 1774, this is the first time any of these men had ever met each other when they were from different regions. And on September 6th, this is the day before the official proceedings, they said, "How should we open?" It's standard, customary tradition to open in prayer. But we have Presbyterians, and we have Quakers, and we have Methodists, and we have Catholics. Different traditions represented here. Samuel Adams said, "I'm no bigot. I can listen to a man who loves his country and loves his God and offers a prayer, a sincere prayer." And Samuel Adams won the day. He is the one who recommended that they have the Reverend Jacob Duché, the minister of the Anglican Church in Philadelphia, Christ Church in Philadelphia. By the way, that's where George Washington went to church regularly when he was serving as a president years later at the Constitutional Convention. And so they had this recommendation, and the very day that they were adjourning this before the next day's proceedings, they received the bad news that there was an assault by the British troops in Boston. September 7th, 1774. Perhaps you've seen this image before. This represents the first day that Congress of the United States ever opened in its official proceedings. And they opened in prayer, thanks in no small part to Samuel Adams. And Reverend Jacob Duché came dressed, in robes and so forth, as is the Anglican tradition, and using the Book of Common Prayer. He had a reading for that particular day. It happened to be in the providence of God, Psalm 35, a psalm of persecution. "Plead my cause, O Lord, with them that strive with me. Fight against them that fight against me. Take hold of buckler and shield. Rise up for my help." And meanwhile, the king and the parliament passed the regulating act, and the goal here would be to impose the Anglican Church as the state church on all of America. If that happened, there would be no more city on a hill, no more errand into the wilderness of the Puritans. The whole experiment of religious liberty would all have been lost. That's it. All of these freedoms earned at the expense of blood, sweat, and toil, gone. This is why they fled. George Bancroft points out, without previous notice to Massachusetts and without a hearing, it took away rights and liberties which the people had enjoyed from the foundation of the colony. Listen to this quote. This quote just blows me away. William Prescott of Pepperell, Massachusetts, said, "We think if we submit to these regulations, all is gone. Our forefathers passed the vast Atlantic, spent their blood and treasure that they might enjoy their liberties, both civil and religious, and transmit them to their posterity. Their children have waded through the seas of difficulty to leave us free and happy in the enjoyment of English liberties and privileges. Now, if we should give them up, can our children rise up and call us blessed? Is a glorious death in defense of our liberties not better than a short, infamous life, and our memories to be had in detestation to the latest posterity?" This blow to American rights was later reflected in the Declaration of Independence when Thomas Jefferson lists out 20 8 specific complaints against the King of England and, frankly, the Parliament. And one of those complaints alludes to the Regulating Act for taking away our charters and abolishing our most valuable laws and altering fundamentally the forms of our government. So on July 4th, we celebrate the 250th anniversary of the Declaration of Independence. This is our nation's birth certificate. As noted, it mentions God 4 times. Above all, he's the source of our rights and the essence of the American experience. The American experiment can really be boiled down to 2 things, 2 ideas: self-rule under God, the consent of the governed. Our rights come from the Creator. They're non-negotiable, therefore. And who started this American experiment of self-rule under God? The Pilgrims. In 1620, not too far from here, Provincetown, they wrote up the Mayflower Compact. In the name of God, amen. We whose names are written, having undertaken a voyage for the glory of God and the advancement of the Christian faith, do covenant and combine ourselves into a civil body politic, self-rule under God. And then what? Well, in the wake of the Pilgrims came the Puritans, who created their colonies based on the biblical basis of covenant, self-rule under God. In 1643, several of these colonies wrote up the New England Confederation. We all came into these parts of America with one and the same end and aim, namely to advance the kingdom of our Lord Jesus Christ and to enjoy the liberties of the gospel in purity with peace. So self-rule under God with religious freedom. But England was willing to bring it all to a crashing halt. So no wonder Samuel Adams and the other patriots said, no, that isn't right. On August 2, 1776, when they began signing the Declaration of Independence, the first one to do it was Samuel Adams, prime mover, ultimately, in that Declaration of Independence. And he said, we have restored this day the sovereign to whom alone men ought to be obedient. He reigns in heaven from the rising to the setting sun. May his kingdom come. Courage then, my countrymen. Our contest is not only whether we ourselves shall be free, but whether there shall be left to mankind an asylum on earth for civil and religious liberty. You know, sometimes we take our freedoms for granted. We don't realize, wow, it's not that way everywhere around the world. And it certainly wasn't that way everywhere around the world at that very time. That's why people like Samuel Adams, sounded the alarm that they did. Later, when Samuel Adams became the governor of this state, Massachusetts, on March 20, 1797, he wrote up a proclamation of a day in fasting and declared, I conceive we cannot better express ourselves than by humbly supplicating the supreme ruler of the world that the confusions that are and have been among the nations may be overruled by the promoting and speedily bringing in the holy and happy period when the kingdoms of our Lord and Savior Jesus Christ may be everywhere established and the people willingly bow to the scepter of him who is the Prince of Peace. Samuel Adams, your governor. One biographer of Samuel Adams, I think this is the highest compliment I ever heard, Benjamin Irvin, wrote in his book about Samuel Adams, he said, in a very real sense, the Declaration of Independence was the culmination of the life work of Samuel Adams. No wonder the British were looking to get him on the night of April 18th, or the morning of April 19th, 1775, in Lexington, the very start of the war. So this July 4th, when we raise a cup, perhaps not with tea, to thank God for America, we should remember to be grateful for the work of Samuel Adams on behalf of our liberties. Thank you.
Thank you very much for filling in a lot of background for us, sure. Since this is really local history for us. Now, is it time for questions? Do we have any questions? Oop.
Fast as I could. Thank you so much for that inspiring talk.
Sure.
My question is, first, a little reference to myself. I grew up in the South Shore of Boston, and we were quite aware of what happened in Lexington and Concord, and the Minutemen and the Sons of Liberty. But I never heard of a reference to the South Shore or the West of Boston. I do think that there were Minutemen who showed up in Lexington and Concord, but I'm not sure about that. Can you speak on that, please?
I'm not sure I fully understood the question, but I can say this. The men in Lexington, they showed up there in that area, on the lawn of the Lexington church. Then after so many of these people got killed, and the British were then marching on the 6 miles later, or 6 miles to Concord. By that time, the word was getting out, even in other states, other territories, such as Connecticut, to come and help us. And so there's that bridge in Concord. The photo, in fact, I had was that bridge in Concord. And basically, it was hard for the British to get across that bridge because the Americans were there. And they were from different places, different, as I say, even Connecticut were among those. So the word got out.
It seems like there were men who were prepared for battle who were not just in that particular area.
Yes, that's correct. And I think what was happening was, over time, the conflicts just began to snowball. And so it all kind of came to a head on April 19, 1775. And so I do think when the British troops started coming in 1768, and they were literally forcing them to be staying in people's houses. So this was a long-standing thing. In fact, in the documentary, I list all these different acts that the king and parliament were passing, and each one was just taking away our liberties. So hope that helps.
Is there another question out there? Well, I would like to ask one.
Sure.
When you were talking about John Adams defending the British in that court case, yes. Could you talk a little bit more about that? I mean, what did he encounter personally? Well,
he was trying to, basically achieve justice for those British soldiers that were in that terrible situation. They were being taunted. Ice chunks in some cases being, thrown at them. There was a side of the Sons of Liberty, especially early on, that Samuel Adams did his best to try and kind of keep these guys under control. There's a fellow named Ebenezer Mackenzie that was a bit of a rabble-rouser, and sometimes would get these kids that didn't have a better, course in life or whatever, and he could use them. But what Samuel Adams was trying to do was, no, we need to do this on Christian principles and so forth. So basically, you still have you have the right to a fair trial. And John Adams, because of Samuel Adams, was operating on that principle. And he said facts are stubborn things. And I love that quote because so often when you start talking about the God factor in American life, and especially in American history, and it's so often ignored, but facts are stubborn things.
Thank you. Anybody? Yes, please, Andrew.
Thank you very much for that talk. I had a question about battle tactics. I sort of remember, of course, the British, the redcoats, and they wore that because they were not afraid to march up, and they did not want their comrades to see blood when they fell. So they had a line of battle, they charged. Did the colonials, especially during these battles, were the Americans also lined up to be shot at, or did they crouch down, stay low, and present a smaller target and gain advantage that way?
Yes, I would say that the Americans did not follow the pattern of the British. In fact, let me give you a great example of that. Okay, and this predates the American War for Independence. But on July 9, 1755, when George Washington was 23 years old, and he was an American with British officers and so forth in a battle that took place on the banks of the Monongahela River in the Pittsburgh area. And what happened was, it was the French and Indian War, and by the way it worked was the British and the Americans and even some Indian troops were against the French and other Indian troops. Okay, but the French and Indians, they were very careful to hide themselves and then just shoot at the British and the Americans, from behind trees and so forth. They were not doing what you were saying, the British lining up and just marching and just being shot at. And in fact, George Washington advised General Braddock, the British man in charge. He said, "Sir, you need to understand something about the tactics that are going to be used here." And General Braddock just kind of brushed him off. And in his hubris, that particular battle ended up becoming a massacre for the British and for the Americans. And George Washington miraculously survived, even though Indians told him later, "We aimed for you, but for you, our rifles did not work." And then he said, "I told my men afterwards, the Great Spirit is preserving that man for a reason, so don't shoot at him anymore." George Washington had 2 horses shot under him. He had 4 bullet holes in his cloak, and his hat was even fired off his head. But he didn't have a scratch. And in fact, he was the only officer in that battle that was not killed, because George Washington did understand something about what you were saying about the tactics here in this continent with the Indians fighting that way. He understood that. By the way, since there was no chaplain available, George Washington took one of his favorite books, which is the Book of Common Prayer, 1662 version, very orthodox book. Peter Lillback, with whom I wrote the book, George Washington's Sacred Fire, he says he had a special copy made for him so that he could have it with him on the battle and so forth. That night, July 9th, 1755, that night, by torchlight, George Washington himself, since there was no chaplain available and he was the only officer around, he read the funeral service for General Braddock. And how does that begin? "I am the resurrection and the life. He that believeth in me, shall live even though he dies." If you go to Mount Vernon to this day, you see the crypt of George Washington. There are bars that kind of, but look in the back, and you can see chiseled in stone behind the sarcophagi of Martha and George Washington, "I am the resurrection and the life." The words of Jesus Christ from John chapter 11.
Thank you.
Sure.
I think you'll be our last question, Brother Joseph.
Okay. I don't know what document, but the John Hancock, the big signature of John Hancock, and he hasn't been mentioned in this, so was he not active with all that's going on?
Oh, yeah. John Hancock was the president of the Second Continental Congress that gave us the Declaration of Independence. He was the first and the only one to sign it, in fact, on the July 4th. And he did it, as you say, he did it with such a beautiful, signature that to this day, put your John Hancock on this document.
Yes.
Yes, and he was willing, therefore, to, by those men signing that document, they were in effect signing their death warrant. So John Hancock was the first. You're absolutely right. And John Hancock was recruited to the cause by Samuel Adams, and he had a lot of money. Samuel Adams didn't have a lot of money. And this is kind of an interesting thing, just real fast, if I could.
Yes.
Before Samuel Adams was sent to represent Massachusetts in the Continental Congress, the one in 1774, the first, the one with the prayer and so forth, he received a knock at the door. He opens the door, and there's somebody that comes in, and he measures him for clothes. So what is this all about? And then he goes back to eating, and someone else came to measure his hat size, and someone else came to measure his shoe size. The people of Boston made donations of nice clothes for Samuel Adams to wear. As a Puritan, in his thinking, it was like a vow of poverty almost. It was like he just didn't care about the worldly things, but others looked out for him, so he would have those. Meanwhile, John Hancock personally was a little bit on the vainglorious side. Sometimes they had a little bit of falling out here and there. And speaking of that, can I share this real fast? Okay. On the night of April 18th, 1775, the midnight ride of Paul Revere. So Paul Revere comes to Reverend Jonas Clark's house. He warns them about the British coming. He comes back about an hour later, and John Hancock is arguing with Samuel Adams. John Hancock wants to stay there and fight the British. And Samuel Adams is like, are you nuts? We're more important to this cause by getting away and being, with the Congress and so forth. This is 1775. The Congress had already met the first time. And John Hancock, no, I'm not a coward. I'm going to stay here. But finally, he was convinced that he would do more for the cause by leaving that night. And he did. And they were both saved. And the country was created as one country, as one nation under God.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you all for coming, and we hope to see you in May. And we'll be covering the Battle of Fort Ticonderoga and Church and State. See you then.